Well, good evening, everybody, friends, members of the Sangha, distinguished guests, to the second series of talks on Mahayana Buddhism. If you'll remember from last year, the BDK sponsored talks were on Japanese Buddhism, whereas the following, fingers crossed, 9 talks will be on themes of the Mahayana. And it's important to really understand. It's very difficult, I think, for Western people to understand what the Mahayana is actually about. It's incredibly simple at base, but because there's just lots of quite complicated philosophical concepts within it, it tends to get complicated, but actually at its root, it's the simplest and most natural thing in the world. Having said that, tonight's talk, we have a very distinguished guest, Charles Muller, who's come all the way from Tokyo, arrived last night, I believe. So thank you so much, Charles, for coming. I should say a little bit about Charles. He's Professor Emeritus of the University of Tokyo. His main research lies in the fields of Korean Buddhism, East Asian Yogacara, and translations of East Asian classical lexicography. And he's publications chairman for the BDK English Tripitaka, author, editor of works on Korean Buddhism, and practitioner of Zen meditation following Korean Seon Buddhism, in other words, Korean Zen practice. The first of these talks is on early Buddhism seen from a Mahayana perspective. So this is a really quite novel, actually, from a Western point of view. Of course, in East Asia, it's quite obvious that this is something that they sort of need to come to terms with. But because Theravada Buddhism, or early Buddhism, came to the UK, before all the other forms of Buddhism, and translations were made and so on, particularly by the Pali Text Society, and a great deal of study went into it. It's the Mahayana that came afterwards, and the Mahayana tends to be looked at through the lens of Theravada Buddhism. So I think to have that perspective tonight from Charles is a very important thing for us. But before I go ahead, I'd just like to thank the BDK, thank the Buddhist Society for funding this, and also thank Tyra and Three Wheels for all the work that you put into it, and everybody at Three Wheels. But Tyra, would you like to say a few words about Charles?
Very short.
Please just come where I am, then you can be heard.
Thank you very much for coming to attend this meeting. And I have met him just yesterday. But I have been meeting him every day while I was writing books on Buddhism, because he is the author of the digital Buddhist dictionary, as the best in the world. I have been using his dictionary every day. So meeting him just yesterday, but I have been meeting him for the last 10 years. But I was very much impressed by this encounter with him. He is a very nice man. Very nice man. And he studied Buddhism to overcome the difficult problems in his life when he was young. And he is very nice. In this sense, he digested Buddhism through his life. And he is not a simple scholar. He understands the importance of practice of Buddhism. And so and he has many friends, and some of them are my friends as well. And he is now a little bit weakened because of his operation of his brain. he is a very strong man. He is karate 4 dan, 4th dan, 4 dan. He's extremely strong. When I was working on his using his digital dictionary, I imagined the author should be very strong man. But I met him yesterday. He was not such a figure. So I asked him, what happened to you? And he said he had operation. But now he's okay. He's okay. Just he has some problem with right hand side. But his mental spirituality working very, very nicely. And his knowledge is so erudite, but at the same time, he is a very soft-minded person. Thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you all for coming, taking time out of your busy day to listen to me. For me, it's a special pleasure to be invited over to come over to London to talk. And most of 95% of my lecturing is done in Japanese because I've lived in Japan, Tokyo, for the last 31 years. So it's a pleasure for me to speak in my own language, or close to this language. And so in terms of the series, so today's lecture, if I can thematize my 3 lectures, I would call them all, say they all fall under the category of right view. And I want to talk about right view from different perspectives. And today is the first of the 3. And for some of you, I'm afraid it's going to be a little bit too basic, but the idea is to establish a vocabulary for the next two lectures after. Let me just briefly introduce myself. So I'm from Long Island, New York, and in '71 I went as a freshman to the University of Dayton in Ohio. But after 3 semesters, I dropped out and followed an Indian guru named Maharaji, who was traveling around the United States at the time. And I joined his organization and lived in an ashram and practiced meditation and yoga. And then there was a big scandal in that organization, and I left and I returned home, and I spent several years, I would just say wandering, doing a lot of crazy things that were bad for me. And then in '79, I stopped all of that, and I stopped abusing myself through substances, to put it directly, and I returned to the university and majored in religion. And in Stony Brook University, the teacher of Buddhism at the time was a Korean man named Pak Sungbae Park, who was a practitioner of Korean Seon Buddhism. So from him, I learned the academic side, but also I learned meditation practice. And in 1984 through '86, I went to study in Japan. And in '87, I went to the University of Virginia to graduate school. And various things didn't work out there, and I ended up going in 1988 back to Stony Brook to a new graduate program that they had started. After finishing that, I got my first job in Tokyo at a small college called Toyo Gakuen University, where I worked for 14 years before I moved to the University of Tokyo. And in 2019, I moved to Musashino University, and I retired last year. In terms of practice, so for about 9 or 10 years, I did Indian yoga meditation. And then from 1981 to present, I have practiced Korean Seon meditation, koan meditation. I'm also a long-time karate practitioner. I learned, I was bullied in junior high school and high school, and I got out of that by learning karate from a very famous Japanese teacher in New York City, and it was based on that that I began to have an interest in Japan. So the major themes of my research are, first was Korean Zen Buddhism. I studied the works of a 13th, 14th century monk named Kiwa. I also studied extensively Confucianism and Taoism. And the center part of my career, for 15 years, I worked on the famous Korean monk Wonhyo. He's known in Japanese as Gangyo, and he's famous as a reconciler of disputes. In other words, he's the only major East Asian commentator who did not belong to any sect of Buddhism, which is, he's unique in that sense. And he wrote commentaries on every scripture, every Mahayana scripture. And his commentaries are deeply respected because his approach was to show how, whether it's a Pure Land approach or Lotus Sutra approach or Yogacara approach, each approach has its own merits and its own perspective, and each perspective is valid within its own framework, and therefore there's no need for intersectarian fighting. So he's called harmonizer. Wonhyo's principal, most influential works had a lot to do with Yogacara Buddhism, and it's through Wonhyo that I became interested in Yogacara Buddhism, mind-only Buddhism. And I published a few books on that. And during the last few years, I moved to the topic of views and beliefs. And from the beginning, from my time in graduate school, I've been interested in translation and lexicography. And Taira Sensei mentioned the dictionary that so in my first year of graduate school, I found out there are no good Chinese to English Buddhist dictionaries. So I compiled everything I looked up, and the computer had just come, PC had just come out, so I began to input and ended up, that's another story. So that's one image of Wonhyo. Okay, so I want to review some key points in the career of the Buddha. So Shakyamuni studied under various teachers. He practiced austerities, like he fasted and went naked and denied himself the denied himself pleasures and so forth, and supposedly he practiced, the scriptures say he practiced like this for 6 years. He is said to have attained very high levels of meditation, but knew that he was not fully enlightened. So he gave up those extreme practices and re-examined everything. Sitting under the Bodhi tree, he re-engaged in meditation and broke through the afflictions desire, anger, pride, and so forth, and delusions, and penetrated to so-called reality. In ancient India, there were several religious and philosophical groups within the broader perspective of Brahmanism, which were later referred to in Buddhist scripture as the 6 non-Buddhist schools. Among most of these, yoga, that is meditation, was practiced by renunciants, shramanas, in order to attain liberation. Most of them believed in reincarnation, karma, liberation, with some of them also practicing austerities. But they believed in reincarnation and karma, but the problem with reincarnation is, at the time of reincarnation, what is reincarnated? Especially in Buddhism, if there's no self, but even if there is a self, what passes away and what is reborn? So, Indian tradition tells us, Brahmanists believe there was something called Atman, that served as an underlying basis of living beings, which did not disappear at death and which continued on to support a subsequent life. Atman was thought to be eternal and changeless, but from another perspective, Atman is trapped in a cyclic existence, which Buddhists would call samsara. Atman can be understood as an individual soul or spirit, but having the special meaning of eternal and changeless. It also has the meaning of subject, I. So when Buddhism came into China, it was translated into Chinese with the ideograph for self. Atman's endless cyclical existence is painful. So shramanas sought a way out of that cyclical existence. The method that was used by most was called yoga, which included meditation, training, and penance. So very simply diagrammed, you have this circle of death and birth, and people are born and they experience afflictions, and they experience enjoyment and so forth, and then they die, and they repeat it again and again and again, and endlessly. So the method of yoga was intended to break this circle, so that in the experience called of liberation, called moksha, so that that person's Atman, this is non-Buddhist, right? This is general Indian philosophy. That Atman could return to its original source, which is Brahman. Ultimately, Shakyamuni's approach, being unsatisfied with trying to apply this explanation, Shakyamuni, based on his enlightenment experience, offered a new explanation as to how transmigration occurs. And that explanation is the famous Four Noble Truths: truth of suffering or dissatisfaction, truth of arising or accumulation, truth of cessation, and truth of the path. Suffering is a translation of the Sanskrit word dukkha, which basically means something like unsatisfactoriness. It doesn't mean that we suffer at every moment, but happiness is transient. And in the end, everything will be lost at death. The Buddha categorized suffering into 8 forms, 4 physical and 4 psychological. The 4 physical forms of suffering are birth, sickness, aging, and death. So why is birth suffering? When babies are born, they come out screaming in pain. They're going into a new environment. And no matter how rich or powerful one is, they can't avoid getting sick, old, or dying. The 4 forms of psychological suffering are separation from that which we love, association with that which we hate, inability to fill our desires, and the 4th, which is a very subtle form of suffering, suffering from the instability of the 5 aggregates. That is, the insecure feeling we have every day when we wake up or when we reflect on ourselves, wondering who or what we are. Nobody can escape these. Arising is a translation of samudaya, which means something like coming up together. Suffering is not simply there, just there. It is based on our behavior and our way of looking at the world. This is a very important point, our way of looking at the world. There is a cause of our suffering, and if there is a cause, that means there must be a way to end it. Cessation is a translation of nirodha, which means something like extinction. Temporary forms of suffering will eventually disappear on their own, but there is also a method to remove suffering. Thus, there is a path, which is a translation of the Sanskrit marga, which also means way or method. The method for removing suffering is called the Eightfold Noble Path. The Eightfold Noble Path is a way of living. It's not that you do number 1 and then do number 2 and then do number 3. You try to incorporate all of these into your life at the same time. But they are right view, right intention, right speech, right behavior, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. I know you probably know all this, but we're going to come back to this later on in the subsequent lectures. The 8 are classified into 3 groups. The first 2 being called wisdom, the second morality, and the third concentration. So all 3 are necessary to have progress. If you have wisdom and morality but don't have concentration, you can't advance. And if you have morality and concentration but no wisdom, you also can't advance. You need all 3. The central problem that the Buddha takes up I think is the relation of cause and effect. And in this sense, it's kind of my approach to understanding Buddhism might be called scientific or rational, because the relation of cause and effect. But the relation of cause and effect, understanding cause and effect, is not simply mentally understanding it, but seeing how deeply cause and effect works in our life. And when you see how deeply it affects us, then it is possible to work on it. So, what kinds of causality are we aware of? The causality that most people are aware of is called simple linear causality. I got a cold because I went out last night in a rainstorm not wearing shoes or something like that. Something happened, and we think about when we get ill, we always think in terms of linear causality. I got this disease because of this, or this happened because of this. And linear causality is valid. We can see it occurring. We can validate it. So linear causality is obvious in terms of short-term or direct causes and effects, or physical actions like applying force to an object. moving things. And even philosophers and doctors and metaphysicians who understand cause and effect deeply still tend to talk in terms of linear causality when they try to solve problems. And it's most of the time, I'll say most of the time in Buddhism, things don't occur because of linear causality, but because of more advanced forms of causality. So we can begin to see this when we think of complex causality. So how do you, when a university student is trying to work towards getting a job after graduation? Well, of course, study is important. Maybe part-time job is important. Human relationships are important. Having respect for others is important. All of these factors combine together to offer a more complex form of causality, which students certainly understand. But it gets more complex when we begin to talk about good and evil, and mental, emotional, and moral behavior. So are there consequences for good or evil, emotional, mental, and emotional and moral behavior? If so, when, where, and how do they occur? So I published a book in 2009 called Living Yogacara, which is a translation of the Egawa Shun'ei, the head monk of Kofukuji's original Japanese work. But I had to write the introduction. And I published it by Wisdom Publications. And in the introduction, I gave examples of people who don't believe there are consequences for good and evil, mental, emotional, moral behavior. So are there causes for unfair and tragic events? For example, a congenital disorder, being born blind or deaf or mentally incapable or something like that. So in Buddhism, of course, they say that's the result of the activities of your prior lifetime. But even if you say that to somebody who's suffering from that kind of condition, it doesn't help them very much. But that's a question that has always been asked in all religions. You know, who's responsible? So if you follow a theocentric religion, a God-oriented religion, you can say that's God's will. And that works a lot. I mean, if you do that in the right way, I have some Muslim friends who will, you know, when a car accident happens or some tragic event that happens, I accept that that's God's will. And if that helps you accept it and get through the suffering, that's also fine. But in Buddhism, that's not a good enough answer, just to accept that that's God's will, because in Buddhism, everything is created in some part by us. And if it's created in some part by us, then we need to learn how to take responsibility so that we don't repeat the mistake, or we know how to undo the mistake. So in ancient India, there are various ways of thinking about causality. For example, and these are not just in ancient India, these are also present day. Some people believe that happiness and suffering are determined by fate. I know a lot of people who think like that. Others believe that everything in the universe comes from a single ultimate permanent cause, similar to the Christian idea of God or Hindu idea of Brahman. So it's God's will. Materialists and nihilists who denied causation altogether and thought that everything just occurred by chance, which allowed them to live an amoral, allowed them to excuse themselves for an amoral life. For Shakyamuni, none of these were sufficient. The Buddha's view is that the causality of karma functions without flaw in all physical, mental, and moral activities. So karma comes from Sanskrit root kara, which is a cognate of English create. So when people say, that's my karma, and I have bad karma, that's not really understanding the word. We are creating our karma every second. We are creating. Thus, in Buddhism, every action, word, and even mental intention will eventually bring an effect, either in this lifetime or a future lifetime. Like the flow of a large river, the flow of causes and effects cannot be cut off. There are no exceptions, like a God, Brahma, etc. This is like Einstein's principle of the conservation of energy, but not limited to the physical domain. So a large river flowing down can be altered and can be affected, but you can't take a large river and suddenly make it turn left. There's too much energy going in one direction. And our own existences, our own karmic flows, are like a large river. So I can decide tomorrow I'm going to try to sleep 15 minutes less, or I'm going to try to eat a little more, and I can do that. But I can't decide tomorrow that I'm going to change into a cat, because that's too much difference in the flow of cause and effect. There's no cause and effect that works for that. So the Buddha also said it is not possible for anything, such as Atman, to exist outside of cause and effect. So the existence of an eternal, unchanging Atman is not possible. Thus, Japanese is muga. We are not an unchanging self. All things, without exception, are the results of a cause, from words, deeds, and thoughts. But how does this causality function? This is where the Buddhist concept of dependent arising becomes important. All things arise based on other things. This is expressed in an early Buddhist text which says, when this is, that is. This arising, that arises. When this is not, that is not. This ceasing, that ceases. The process of dependent arising, in its simplified version, says we have nescience, or ignorance, and we have desire, thirst. And nescience and thirst bring about birth, which brings about aging, which brings about death. Nescience, ignorance, Japanese mumyo, Sanskrit avidya, is not just like I didn't read the paper today, or I didn't know this, or I didn't know that. Nescience is a basic inability to understand the way of our existence. And I think you know the 12 stages of dependent arising, but the key stages are considered to be stages number 1, that is nescience, ignorance, and stages 8 and 9, because those are the places at which meditative techniques have some effect at stopping. Most of the rest, 1 through 6, all happen at the subconscious level. So we have this process. Nescience, it gives rise to, is the basis for intentions. Intentions is the basis for consciousness, name and form, and so forth. And the reverse process for doing spiritual work is to go the reverse direction. So meditative techniques are supposed to uncover this process and allow us to be free from it. That's the 12-link process of dependent arising, which we read in a lot of Pali text, pre-Mahayana text. Once you get into Mahayana and even Abhidharma, the 12 stages of dependent arising is still considered valid, but people tend to focus more on a network version of dependent arising. So this is a very simple example. When I do this on the blackboard in class, I have many more factors, but for a flower to grow, you need soil, you need oxygen, you need water, you need fertilization from insects, you need certain kinds of care, you need a certain kind of environmental change, you need influences from the stars, you need influences from the sun, and it goes on and on and on until one flower includes the whole universe. And that's the kind of cause and effect we are experiencing in our own lives. In the case of ourselves, what is I? So, I is created from all these factors around, from past, present, and future. Our grandparents, our parents, our language, education, culture, food, sports, diet, environment. But also, what we are is also controlled by our future. What do I expect to be? What am I aiming for? Do I want to get married? Do I want to have children? Do I want to work in a company? Do I want to be a teacher? That's all contained in the present, contained in us. So what we are is a complex structure of all of these factors. But in truly understanding dependent arising, cause and effect is going in both ways. So we're not just who we are by the influence from our friends. We are also influencing who our friends are. We are not just who we are because of our language. We are influencing our own language by the words we use. So we are also part of this matrix going the other way. And all of these factors are at the same time influencing each other. So, dependent causality is not simply linear causality, which is the way we tend to think. It is complex networked causality. Therefore, the production of an effect is the result of countless other factors. It is a unique Buddhist doctrine not found in other religions or philosophies. However, it can be understood as being similar to general systems theory. Does anybody here know what general systems theory is? No. Or ecological theory in modern science. If you have a chance, go on the internet and look up general systems theory. You'll be amazed at what they have, what our modern thinkers have come up with in terms of creation of things, the cause and effect of things. It's totally the model of dependent arising. And ecology also, the word ecology means network. So general systems theory people and ecological theory people can understand this kind of framework very well. Okay, let me stop here for a moment and see. I don't know exactly how much time I used. I used about 38 minutes. So let's just see if anybody has any questions or comment. Yes, please.
If time is an illusion, then how can you have cause and effect?
I didn't say time was an illusion.
No, I said that.
Oh, okay.
Having read it somewhere else.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah, well, I don't think that the fact that causes bring effects would have much relationship to time to time theory. That would be a separate issue. Not that time doesn't exist, but cause and effect occurrence is not contingent upon, because time is a construct also. Time is a mental construct which we are applying to make a judgment, but the existence of time or non-existence or the illusoriness of time wouldn't really, in my understanding, wouldn't really matter. Yes, please.
You hinted at the big challenge for Buddhism in putting forward a theory of momentariness and lack of inherent. Sorry?
We can't hear us very well. So.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear now?
Okay.
Yeah, you can hear. How does Buddhism face the challenge of a theory of momentariness and lack of inherent existence with, as you say, cause and effect, future moral retribution? What carries forward a retribution from a karmic act to a future time if there is no inherent self-substantial entity?
That's a great question. And that's what that's going to be dealt with in my next lecture. So, given this situation, given the problematic nature of causality and the relationship of cause and effect, how does an individual occurrence bring itself about? How do I, who has no self, develop myself into something else in the future, according to the law of cause and effect? So the problem is that we're working with a viewpoint that an entity exists, an entity called I. Entities in the world exist. But if we realize that's just a view, this sounds like kind of escaping, I guess. But if we realize that's just a view, then the cause and effect itself becomes more apparent. Please ask further if you want more clarification, or if I've gone off.
I'll wait. I'll wait for later.
Okay. So the main point of today's lecture is just to. So I taught Buddhism for years and years, and if some student asked, so the story goes, the Buddha did serious meditative practice and serious studies under the greatest masters of the time, and he wasn't satisfied, and then he went and sat under the Bodhi tree, and then he was enlightened. And a lot of times my students would ask me, what was that enlightenment? What was the content of that enlightenment? And I wasn't really satisfied with my own answers. But studying Buddhism and cause and effect and the dependent arising, I became to see that what the Buddha saw was he He saw very deeply the relationship between cause and effect, that there was nothing outside of cause and effect, and that everything we are is generated from cause and effect that we are operating within. So that's how I come to this this is my description of what the Buddha understood when he was awakened. He deeply, thoroughly understood the relationship of cause and effect for the first time. Any other question? Yes.
I've got a slightly childish question, which always had guiltily in the back of my mind, which is that how can it's a silly question, but there are some sufferings that are so intense that people would desire cessation.
Right.
But most of us don't want cessation. I would be thrilled not to have it.
Right.
I would be delighted
Right.
to think that I could create good causes that would mean that I wouldn't go into extinction. I wouldn't go back into a forgotten nothingness,
Right.
into a future nothingness.
Right.
I'd be so happy, but so I wonder why this very idea started. That's all. That's probably a
Yeah,
bad
so
question.
what the Buddha's the difference between the Buddha's thinking and the other religious schools' thinking is all of the contemporary Brahmanistic Indian philosophies thinking was identity thinking, based on a feeling of I, a feeling of self, a feeling of having control. And the teaching of dependent arising showed that that's all kind of illusion, a kind of fantasy. So what the Buddha's answer is not get rid of the suffering, but uncover who you are. Find out who you are, what you are, and how you are causing how you are causing yourself to be a certain way. But if you're a person who is in the situation of being in severe suffering, psychological or physical, then you should see a doctor. So this is kind of denial. This is a kind of emptiness way of viewing things, in the sense that we don't attach to being selves, but at the same time, so that's why Buddhism has two truths: ultimate truth and relative truth, or conventional truth. And the ultimate truth is this: everything is causation. But the relative truth is, when you're sick, you should see a doctor. When you have a cold, you should take cold medicine, or whatever people do. So we have to work with, that's still working within cause and effect, but within a more phenomenal, everyday life experience of cause and effect that can be understood and can be explained in a scientific way. But the two do not need to deny each other. Is that at all helpful?
Yes, very.
Yes.
Professor, you mentioned that the Buddha identified the link between cause and effect. And I remember at the beginning of the talk, I just saw that slide that had there was two other explanations. One was fate, I think.
Yeah, kind of acceptance that everything is fate, right? Acceptance that everything is decided. So I'm going to get married. That's decided. I'm going to get cancer when I'm 55. That's all decided and nothing can be done about it. And the other is kind of nihilism, that nothing is decided. And therefore even your positive moral effort is not useful. That's a kind of, those are two extremes. The other is, do I have, so the first is an extreme of, first of it is the extreme of thinking that you have control, or that somebody has control, where the second extreme is just giving up on cause and effect completely and saying nothing has any meaning, and no matter what we do, you can't change anything because everything is random. And people nowadays, I think people still suffer from the same problem. You know, when in Japan, a lot of young people commit suicide because of inability to pass entrance examinations or because of inability to communicate. So they think there's no way out of their situation. And that means they're taking one of these extremes, like that's God's will, or everything is random and nothing can be done about it. But Buddhist way would be to say everything changes. So there is a way out, and if you make effort and if you seek the way, you can bring about a change. Does that answer your question?
Yes, Professor, thank you.
Okay. So, is it time?
It can be, but I have to go now, unfortunately.
Okay.
But we can go on talking, and then there will be reception downstairs, so please do hang around. And should I just say that after the third talk, we're going to leave a much more extended period for questions and answers. But by that time, we'll know each other a bit better.
Yeah,
And
sure.
we'll know more of the subject, and therefore the questions will be much more relevant. But can I thank you, Charles, so much for today.
All right, thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And thank you also, audience, for coming. See you all next week.